The year was 1940. A young John F. Kennedy sat in his small apartment in London, surrounded by books and newspapers, trying to make sense of a world descending into chaos. He was 23 years old, working on research that would become his Harvard senior thesis, watching the city prepare for German bombs. Across town, Winston Churchill had just become Prime Minister of a Britain standing alone against Nazi Germany. These two men had never met, but Churchill's words and example would shape Kennedy's understanding of leadership in ways that would echo through history. This isn't a story of extensive mentorship. It's about a young leader inspired by another's courage and example, how one generation's defiance of tyranny informed the next generation's decisions at the brink of nuclear war. John Kennedy arrived in London in late 1939 as the second son of Ambassador Joseph Kennedy. His father was controversial in Britain. Joseph Kennedy believed the British couldn't win against Germany and advocated for American neutrality. These views put him at odds with the British establishment, especially with Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty. Young Jack Kennedy was different. While his father saw only Britain's weaknesses, Jack saw the determination of ordinary people to resist. He traveled through war-torn Europe in summer 1939, visiting Poland just before the German invasion. In letters to his father, preserved in the Kennedy Presidential Library, he wrote that Europe was heading for catastrophe and that perhaps his father's pessimism was misplaced. Churchill was giving the speeches that would define his legacy. In October 1939, he broadcast warnings about the Nazi threat. In May 1940, as Prime Minister, he promised nothing but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. In June, after Dunkirk, he declared Britain would never surrender. Kennedy heard these speeches and read reports of all of them. According to Nigel Hamilton's biography, they made a profound impression. Kennedy used Churchill's speeches as sources for his senior thesis. Upon returning to the United States, he completed his work at Harvard and later published it as Why England Slept. In this book, Kennedy analyzed Britain's failure to rearm against the Nazi threat during the 1930s. He wrote, "We should profit by the lesson of England and make our democracy work. We must make it work, right now. Any system of government will work when everything is going well. It's the system that functions in the pinches that survives."
Kennedy was critical of British leadership, but recognized something crucial. Churchill had been right all along. Churchill had warned about Hitler when others wanted peace. Churchill had called for rearmament when others called for disarmament. And now Churchill was leading Britain through its darkest hour. Kennedy observed that Churchill's warnings in the 1930s had been ignored because people didn't want to hear them. It was easier to believe Chamberlain's promises of peace than Churchill's warnings of war. This insight about democratic leadership constrained by public opinion would stay with Kennedy throughout his political career. There's no evidence Kennedy and Churchill met during this period. Joseph Kennedy certainly met Churchill in official functions, and those meetings were tense. According to Foreign Office records in the National Archives UK, Churchill distrusted the American ambassador's defeatist attitude. In one documented exchange from October 1940, Churchill told Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax that Joseph Kennedy's pessimism was damaging Anglo-American relations. But young Jack was forming his own views. His time in London, watching British resilience under the Blitz, studying Churchill's rhetoric, analyzing the failure of appeasement, this created the intellectual foundation for his own political philosophy. The two men's paths diverged. Kennedy became a war hero with the PT-109 incident in 1943, swimming for hours while towing a wounded crewman after a Japanese destroyer rammed his patrol boat. Both proved their courage in different theaters. After the war, Kennedy entered politics, Congress in 1946, Senate in 1952. Churchill served as prime minister again from 1951 to 1955, then retired from active political life. Their worlds remained separate, but Kennedy continued studying Churchill's career intensively. In the Senate, Kennedy gave speeches about American strength against Soviet expansion. According to Theodore Sorensen's memoir, Kennedy specifically referenced Churchill's warnings about Hitler when discussing the Soviet threat. The lesson was clear: democracies must maintain strength, even in peacetime, because tyrants only respect power.
Kennedy wrote Profiles in Courage in 1956 about senators who took unpopular stands on principle. The book won a Pulitzer Prize. While Churchill wasn't an American senator, his example permeated the book's theme. True courage in politics means standing alone when necessary, even when public opinion demands otherwise. Then came 1958. The meeting that would be the only significant direct encounter between Winston Churchill and John F. Kennedy took place not in a government office or state function, but aboard Aristotle Onassis's yacht, the Christina, in the south of France. Churchill, now 83 years old and long retired from active politics, was cruising in the Mediterranean. Senator Kennedy and his wife Jacqueline were invited to dine with the former prime minister. For Kennedy, this was the moment he had been waiting for, a chance to meet the man whose career he had studied so intensively, whose speeches had shaped his understanding of leadership, whose warnings about Hitler had proven so prescient. According to accounts from the International Churchill Society and documented by Richard Langworth, the conversation centered on politics. Kennedy sought Churchill's advice, eager to learn from the elder statesman's decades of experience. Here was the young senator, already thinking about higher office, sitting across from the man who had saved Western civilization. Churchill, despite his advanced age, engaged with Kennedy on the serious questions facing the Western world. They discussed the Soviet threat, the challenges of democratic leadership, and the responsibilities of power. While no detailed transcript of their conversation exists, those who documented the meeting noted that Kennedy was deeply attentive, absorbing Churchill's perspectives on leadership and statecraft. This 1958 meeting was significant not because it lasted for days or because Churchill gave Kennedy specific policy prescriptions, but because it allowed Kennedy to connect personally with the example he had studied from afar. Kennedy could see firsthand the man behind the speeches, the leader who had stood alone against Hitler, the statesman who had warned his nation when it didn't want to hear the truth. Jackie Kennedy later recalled her husband's profound respect for Churchill. The meeting aboard the Christina confirmed what Kennedy had learned from his studies, that Churchill embodied the kind of leadership free societies needed in dangerous times. When Kennedy ran for president in 1960, he ran on American strength. He criticized the Eisenhower administration for a supposed missile gap with the Soviets. He talked about defending freedom worldwide. He spoke about the new frontier, challenging Americans to meet the tests of their time. The echoes of Churchill's rhetoric were unmistakable to those who knew both men. Kennedy won in November 1960. Churchill, now 86 and in declining health, sent a congratulatory message, brief and formal, expressing confidence in Anglo-American relations. Churchill recognized that leadership of the free world was passing to a new generation, and he had met this young president 2 years earlier aboard the Christina. In April 1961, Churchill made what would be one of his final visits to the United States. Though technically a private visit since Churchill was no longer in government, its significance was clear to all. According to various accounts, Churchill and President Kennedy saw each other briefly during this visit, though their 1958 meeting remained their only extended conversation. Less than 3 weeks after Churchill's 1961 visit, Kennedy faced the Bay of Pigs crisis. The CIA-planned invasion of Cuba by anti-Castro exiles failed spectacularly. Kennedy took full public responsibility.
According to multiple Kennedy administration officials, including Dean Rusk's memoir, Kennedy spent days after the failure reading about past military disasters and how leaders recovered. He specifically read about Churchill's role in the Gallipoli campaign during World War I, a disastrous operation that nearly ended Churchill's career. Churchill had learned from Gallipoli, rebuilt his reputation, and became the leader who saved Britain in World War II. Kennedy took inspiration from that example. Kennedy rebuilt his credibility. He stood firm in Berlin when Khrushchev threatened Western access. In June 1963, he gave his famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech, declaring American solidarity with West Berlin. The rhetoric echoed Churchill's defiant speeches during the Blitz. Then came October 1962 and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet missiles were being installed in Cuba, 90 miles from American shores. Kennedy's military advisors urged immediate airstrikes. The pressure for action was immense. But Kennedy chose a naval blockade combined with diplomacy, buying time for peaceful resolution while demonstrating resolve.
According to Robert Kennedy's memoir, 13 Days, President Kennedy referenced historical examples during crisis deliberations. He talked about how World War I started partly because leaders felt pressured to act quickly. He talked about leaving the adversary room to retreat without complete humiliation. Kennedy told his advisors the goal was to be both strong and patient, show American power while giving Khrushchev a way out. In this approach, Kennedy was applying lessons from Churchill's career. Churchill had shown strength against Hitler while also advocating for negotiations with the Soviets from a position of strength. Kennedy understood that strength and diplomacy weren't opposites, they were complements. Perhaps Kennedy thought back to that evening in 1958 aboard the Christina, the conversations with Churchill about leadership and the Soviet threat. Churchill had lived through 2 world wars and understood the cost of conflict. Now Kennedy faced a crisis that could lead to nuclear war, and he drew on everything he had learned from studying Churchill's example. The missile crisis ended peacefully. Khrushchev removed the missiles from Cuba. Kennedy, in secret negotiations, removed obsolete American missiles from Turkey. Kennedy had faced down the Soviet threat without starting nuclear war. Churchill, following these events from England, reportedly expressed satisfaction with Kennedy's handling of the crisis. According to Anthony Montague Brown's memoir published in 1995, Churchill said Kennedy had done well, showing both strength and judgment. The young senator he had met 4 years earlier aboard the Christina had proven himself as a leader. Kennedy died in November 1963, assassinated in Dallas. Churchill, hearing the news in London, was deeply saddened. According to multiple accounts, including Montague Brown's memoir, Churchill wept when told of Kennedy's death. He said Kennedy reminded him of young men who died in the wars, men of promise whose potential would never be fully realized. Churchill attended Kennedy's funeral in Washington. It was one of his last major public appearances. Official records show Churchill sitting in the National Cathedral, visibly moved as the nation mourned. He walked in the procession despite his advanced age. Perhaps he thought of that evening in 1958, dining with the young senator and his beautiful wife, discussing the future of the Western world. Churchill died 14 months later, in January 1965. The connection between these two men had been brief in terms of direct personal contact, essentially one significant meeting aboard a yacht in 1958, with a brief encounter in 1961. But Churchill's example had shaped Kennedy's understanding of leadership profoundly.
Kennedy had studied Churchill's warnings about Hitler and learned that democratic leaders must tell hard truths even when the public doesn't want to hear them. He had read Churchill's wartime speeches and learned that words can inspire courage in dark times. He had examined Churchill's career and learned that leaders can recover from mistakes if they have the courage to continue. Most importantly, from both his studies and his 1958 conversation with Churchill, Kennedy learned that defending freedom requires both conviction and restraint. Churchill showed strength against Hitler, but waited for the right moment to strike. Kennedy applied these lessons during the Cuban Missile Crisis, demonstrating resolve through blockade while maintaining space for a diplomatic solution. The relationship demonstrates how political influence can work across generations. A leader's example, writings, and speeches can inspire others even with minimal personal contact. Churchill influenced Kennedy primarily through the public record of his leadership, reinforced by one significant evening of conversation in 1958. In his inaugural address in January 1961, Kennedy called on Americans to bear the burden of defending freedom worldwide. He said, "Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, in order to assure the survival and the success of liberty." These words echoed Churchill's commitment to standing against tyranny, no matter the cost. Kennedy also absorbed Churchill's understanding of leadership's weight. In his American University speech in June 1963, Kennedy talked about the responsibilities of the nuclear age. He said both the United States and Soviet Union had mutual interest in avoiding nuclear war. He called for a more thoughtful approach to the Cold War tensions. This is the real story of what Churchill said about Kennedy and what Kennedy learned from Churchill. One significant meeting in 1958 aboard a yacht in the Mediterranean. Years of Kennedy studying Churchill's career, speeches, and writings, and the application of those lessons when Kennedy faced his own moment of testing during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Churchill showed in World War II that democracies could summon courage to fight tyranny. Kennedy showed during the Cuban Missile Crisis that democracies could exercise restraint under pressure. Both lessons were essential. In the Kennedy Presidential Library today, researchers can read Kennedy's thesis that became Why England Slept. They can see how extensively Kennedy studied Churchill's warnings about Hitler and the failure of appeasement. They can read Kennedy's speeches and see echoes of Churchill's rhetoric. They can examine Kennedy's crisis decision-making and see application of lessons drawn from Churchill's example. This influence shows us how leadership is learned. Kennedy studied history intensively. He drew lessons from leaders before him. He had one significant opportunity to meet Churchill directly and seek his advice. He applied those lessons to his own challenges. The story of Churchill and Kennedy is about continuity of democratic leadership across generations. It's about how values of freedom and courage pass down through example, through study, through one crucial conversation aboard a yacht, and through each generation's determination to live up to standards set by those before. Churchill didn't need to tell Kennedy exactly what to do during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Their 1958 meeting had allowed Kennedy to understand the man behind the legend. Kennedy had spent years studying Churchill's career. He had developed his own judgment about when to show strength and when to exercise restraint. When the moment came, Kennedy made the right choice. This is what Churchill gave Kennedy. Through his example, his writings, his speeches, and one evening of conversation in 1958, a model of leadership under pressure, a demonstration that democracies could defend themselves effectively, proof that courage and judgment were essential qualities of leadership in dangerous times. Kennedy received that gift. He learned those lessons. He applied them when the world needed him to. The connection between these two men reminds us that leadership is about learning from those who came before, standing on their shoulders, and applying timeless principles to new challenges. Churchill influenced Kennedy across a generation, and both men influenced all who came after them. Their legacy is the ongoing commitment to defend freedom with wisdom, a legacy that remains as vital today as it was in their time.
All information presented in this video is derived from documented historical sources, including published memoirs, official archives, Kennedy's own writings, biographical research, scholarly works, and International Churchill Society documentation. The 1958 meeting between Churchill and Kennedy aboard Aristotle Onassis' yacht is documented by the International Churchill Society and other historical sources, whereas viewers are advised to consult multiple sources for study. Historical interpretations may vary among scholars and historians. This content is intended for educational purposes.